Hi, everybody. My name is Delaney Goodwin. I'm the Associate Director of Conscious Business at Channel Factory. And today I'm sitting down with Dr. Peter Macaulay to talk about digital self-harm. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for being here today.
No problem at all. It's lovely to be here.
Amazing. Why don't you start by introducing yourself and then we'll jump right in.
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name's Dr. Peter Macaulay, and I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Derby, based in England, in the UK. And my research and background specialism is looking at online safety more broadly, but specifically looking at things like bullying behaviours in the school environment, how that kind of transfers into the online domain, looking at cyberbullying. And more recently, what I'm looking at the moment is this new kind of phenomenon that we refer to as digital self-harm. And that's something that, from a research point of view and a policy point of view, that's something I'm particularly interested in looking at.
Amazing. Okay, so to start, let's ground everybody in the basics. How do you define digital self-harm? What makes it different from other forms of self-harm content that we see online?
So I guess digital self-harm, in terms of, let's treat it as like an umbrella term, digital self-harm. It's also referred to as self-cyberbullying. And I guess compared to other self-harm content that we may see online, just to give you an example, it could be viewing kind of content related to eating behaviors or eating disorders, or it could be viewing self-harm content, for example, a blog about self-harm, for example. So digital self-harm is actually when an individual will go online and they'll anonymously post abusive or harmful messages about themselves, often on the same platforms that they use publicly. So just to give you an example of how that looks in reality, typically this happens during early to mid and late adolescence. So an adolescent or an older child will go online, let's say onto an online public forum. They will sign in onto this public forum as a guest to keep their identity anonymous. And then on this public forum, they may post negative comments about themselves. So they'll be posting their name saying, for example, Peter Smith looks like X, Y, and Z, trying to incite further negative abuse from other people. So there's lots of reasons why young people do this, but one way that I kind of look at why young people do it is almost kind of like a call for help, and also kind of trigger warning system. So I guess digital self-harm, the first kind of case that we witnessed of digital self-harm came back to 2013. That was the kind of first public spotlight we had of digital self-harm. And that was from Hannah Smith from Leicestershire in the UK, England, died by suicide. And unfortunately, the investigation of that suicide found out actually the months leading up to her suicide was actually, there was lots of evidence of digital self-harm content. So even though the first case was going back to 2013, from a research point of view, there's actually very little research evidence that has actually looked at digital self-harm content. And that's why I myself, as a researcher, is interested to look at, well, what is digital self-harm, and how can we, from a researcher, practitioner, and policy point of view, come up with strategies to prevent it.
Certainly. And can you dig in a little bit more into what motivates young people to participate in this? Do motivations differ by age, by gender? What?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the motivations, in terms of, well, why do young people engage in this behavior? There's quite an array and varied reasons why young people do this. So one explanation is it can also act as like an expression of internalized self-criticism, and doing so in a very public or semi-public way. And when I talk about public versus semi-public, what I mean by that is public would be something that is accessible to anybody online. So posting something on an online public forum, hundreds and thousands of people could see that. It's not restricted to a particular audience. Whereas if an adolescent went online and started posting negative, derogatory comments about themselves, but within a particular group, so let's say a Facebook group or a particular community, only that community or that group would have access to that content. So that would be more of a semi-public incident. So in terms of the factors that may predict when somebody, or motivations for why somebody may engage in digital self-harm, Lots of research suggests there's things related to individuals that have low self-esteem and self-worth, individuals that are having difficulty coping with depression, potentially those individuals that have a lower level of social anxiety, loneliness. There's lots of research studies to suggest that those are the sorts of factors that may predict when somebody may be more vulnerable to digital self-harm and engaging in that behavior. But on the other side of it, there's also research explanations to suggest that individuals may engage in this behavior to test friendships. So, for example, an individual may go online, engage in digital self-harm content, in other words, posting negative, derogatory comments anonymously about oneself, and they can see who sees that content. They can see if anybody likes it. They can see if anybody shares it. They can see what other people are talking about in terms of the comment thread about what they've just said. So actually, if they can see their friends are saying certain things about them, or their friends are liking or sharing that particular content, it's almost an element of testing friendships. So that's another particular explanation. And more recently, some recent research has suggested that some individuals engage in digital self-harm almost to beat bullies. So instead of kind of running the risk of becoming the next victim, you can order some young people feel that they gain control by engaging in digital self-harm because they become not only the victim themselves, but they also become the bully. So there's lots and lots of explanations for why young people engage in digital self-harm behavior. A really kind of big national study in the USA, for example, by Patchen and Hinduja, 2017. They did a large-scale national survey of over 5,000 12 to 17-year-olds in the US. And they found that approximately 6% of those individuals, those 12 to 17-year-olds, have engaged in digital self-harm content. Now, you may think that 6% doesn't actually seem like quite a high percentage, but actually, if we think about 6% of over 5,000 young people in that particular study are going online and are saying really nasty, derogatory comments about themselves in an anonymous way and posting it for other people to see, that is quite an alarming percentage. And that particular study also looked at factors that may predict motivations for engaging in digital self-harm. So just to kind of give a few examples, they found that one of the factors was sexual orientation. So they found that those individuals that identified with LGBTQ plus were 3 times more likely to engage in this behavior. More importantly, those individuals that had previous experience of school bullying and also cyberbullying. So whether you're a victim or you're a bully of traditional face-to-face bullying in the school environment, or a victim of bullying online, you are 4 to 5 times or 7 to 12 times more likely to engage in digital self-harm. So those were kind of the factors that kind of came through that particular research in terms of explaining why young people engage in digital self-harm. But I guess just to kind of finish on that particular question, there's also other factors associated with the actual digital technology that young people engage with. So thinking about digital technology in itself, there's lots of mechanisms that allow young children to engage with digital technology in quite sophisticated ways that they can conceal their identity. So the fact that it's so easy now for children to go online, conceal their identity, makes it a lot easier for children to engage in behaviors like digital self-harm. And then also even things down to kind of algorithms. So if you've got kind of a vulnerable person that is vulnerable or susceptible to suicidal thoughts, ideation, for example, and maybe they've been viewing, whether that be directly or indirectly, self-harming content online, algorithms would therefore maybe present quite disturbing or negative content when they're kind of on their social media platforms. And that unfortunately may incite them to then engage in digital self-harming behavior as a way of expressing their emotion, instead of kind of acting self-harm in its traditional manner in terms of cutting him or herself, actually enacting it online as a way to kind of express that emotion in more of a psychological way.
Sure. To your point on the role that platforms play in this, right? There are features like comments, likes, reposts, anonymity, right?
Yeah.
And these sort of things can obviously amplify risk. Are there features that you've seen that can reduce harm? What would you say to the platforms? What can they do better? What are they already doing well? What's your take on the platform role in this?
So yeah, I think there's lots of things that platforms can do to, and I guess ultimately platforms play the key role here in terms of actually whether they're, depending on what they're doing, whether that's amplifying or mitigating the risk of digital self-harm. So if we just take one example, that's quite a widely used feature across lots of digital social media applications. Regardless of what that social media application is, a lot of social media applications have features like comments, likes, reposting, sharing, distributing. All of those kind of features in itself inadvertently act as tools for other young people to further disseminate that information. So if we look at the kind of the like and dislike feature that is typical in social media applications, for example, um, if a young child is engaging in digital self harm and other individuals that now witness that kind of content, by liking that content, that is further kind of attributing negative consequences to the original person that posted that comment, because they're seeing that other people are almost supporting the negative content that they've said about themselves. Even things like the comments and the threads, for example, other people kind of almost jump on the bandwagon. So if you've said something really negative about oneself and you've posted it online, other people may start posting comments to say, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I saw that person the other day and they looked like X, Y, and Z, and start actually jumping on the bandwagon and joining in of that negative abuse. And then that individual that is at home, probably by themselves, is then viewing that content as it's coming in a continuous manner, which is then kind of spiraling that distressing emotional reaction, so to say. So that kind of comment threading, kind of allowing other people to kind of jump on the bandwagon and kind of say what they want, almost kind of spirals the negative impact that that individual is going to experience. Some things that platforms can do to potentially mitigate things like digital self-harm is trying to incorporate tools or mechanisms to reduce visibility of anonymous comments. So it may be that other people are joining in, kind of saying other negative things. But actually, if platforms can utilize ways to reduce visibility of other anonymous comments, then it reduces the attention to that sort of content. And then in addition to that, kind of platforms working with kind of mental health organizations and charities and actually ad and brand companies to facilitate an environment that with kind of algorithms as well, when content like this appears online, actually having kind of resources, content specific resources related to kind of mental health and suicide to try and offer help and resources that individual can then refer to, hopefully before they actually engage in that digital self-harm content.
Certainly. And you briefly touched on this one piece, the brand side, the advertiser side, right? So how
Yeah.
should advertisers and brands think about adjacency to digital self-harm content? What responsibilities do advertisers have? Where should they draw the boundaries? How can they engage with platforms on these issues? And how can they engage better with folks like yourself on these issues?
Yeah, so I think advertisers and brands play another big role in this kind of industry, and I think ultimately advertisers and brands, I think it's really important that they have a working relationship with platforms and other digital kind of platforms, because ultimately the content appears on the digital platforms. So advertisers and brands, which often appear on kind of social media applications and the digital platforms themselves, need to work with each other to kind of develop an environment that is kind of open, allows kind of individuals to kind of engage with advertisers and brands to kind of seek help and support. So one way to do that is actually advertisers and brands kind of having ad placement next to distressing content. So going back to one of my previous examples, thinking about an individual that is actively seeking out information or content related to suicide ideation or suicidal plans, for example. If there are opportunities for advertisers and brands to have ad placements next to such blogs or such information or such forums, for example, then when that individual is directly seeking that content and comes across that content, they're also coming across ads content related to, it could be suicidal organizations or charities. It could be mental health more broadly. It could be opportunities for the individual to kind of seek help in a safe and trusting environment. So I think ad placement is particularly important, especially in the context of placing it next to distressing content. The reason that why that's important is because it's the distressing content online where the vulnerable users are going to be. And I think that's the important message here, because if you're a vulnerable user at risk of kind of digital self-harm content, but content whereby you have access to ad placements related to kind of mental health, it may kind of make you think twice before you post such content, or it may make you think twice before you start reading a blog about a distressing content related to self-harm. So I think ad placement is particularly important. But another thing that I think needs to be kind of explored is the idea of kind of brand safety and the tools that can be used. And often kind of with kind of digital platforms as well and social media applications, they may not fully understand the nuance of mental health context. So actually, I think there's scope here for digital platforms, advertisers and brands, as well as researchers and practitioners to almost triangulate information and work together from a research evidence point of view. So advertisers and brands can get research informed evidence about how best to present information in a digital context to allow individuals and vulnerable users to kind of engage in that content. So I think the sum here is that advertisers are the key actors in kind of driving platform reform to allow kind of users to feel safer online.
Certainly. And just a quick question. I'm more so curious about this, if this is something that you deal with. Are there any privacy concerns when it comes to doing research in this space? You mentioned anonymity being a huge part of all of this, right?
Yeah.
To detect or intervene, with this type of behavior, how do you combat that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question, something that I think the lines are quite blurred in terms of what exactly is the most appropriate way forward when it comes to kind of ethical and privacy concerns. So one of the risks, especially when it comes from kind of researcher involvement with kind of platforms in order to kind of detect and intervene these sorts of information, is obviously the risk of misidentifying information or misidentifying content. So it may be actually researchers may be wanting to work with platforms, advertisers and brands in relation to digital self-harm. And some of the ethical and privacy concerns related to that is risk of misidentifying the content that is said. And one example of that is individuals may post content online that may come across negative, derogatory, harming, distressing, but actually the intention of that individual may have initially intended that post to come across as sarcasm or maybe as a joke. And actually the initial intent wasn't about kind of causing distress or redirecting that negative abuse back to oneself. So that issue about intent, what comes across as intent to inflict harm back to oneself, which would be digital self-harm, compared to the intent to post something that to other people may come across quite distressing or disturbing, but the intent of that initial post was actually to do a joke or being a bit sarcastic or being a bit banterous, for example. So there's a fine line between intent and banter and actually what does actually lead to harm compared to what is actually digital self-harm in itself. So the risk of kind of misidentifying information, I think, is definitely one kind of ethical and privacy concern that is quite difficult to address in its kind of finality, because ultimately we, as a researcher or as a practitioner or whatever it may be, we can't fully understand the intent of somebody's actions online without obviously having kind of direct access to that individual. So it's quite hard to kind of interpret what actually is kind of intentional digital self-harm behavior compared to something that may act as an initial joke or banter. But I guess another kind of ethical privacy concern is the kind of the surveillance online. So thinking about the context of young people, children, adolescents, privacy is something of particularly importance, especially kind of that transition from childhood to adolescence. Adolescents are going through this period of kind of role confusion. They kind of want to form their identity. They're not sure who they are. They're kind of going through this period of role experimentation. And actually, within that period, it's very critical that adolescents and young people feel like they've got the trust of those that they're interacting with. So an ethical or privacy concern kind of engaging or overlooking things related to digital self-harm is this notion about surveillance. If young people feel like they're being constantly surveyed online, constantly policed online, that may change the way that young people use digital technology. So I think that's something that's important to consider. And I guess in relation to that, if we're considering how we can monitor behavior online in order to reduce things like digital self-harm, I guess we need to be more transparent. We need to be more transparent about what sort of detection methods are online and what sort of detection methods we can utilize and access. And also importantly, I think maybe we're looking at this picture on the individual that's engaging in digital self-harm. But I think it's also important to promote to other people online the tools that are available to them to report cases like digital self-harm. So if young people come across something that is negative, derogatory, maybe there's kind of an assumption that this could be digital self-harming behavior, reporting mechanisms online. Young people need to feel like they've got the trust in reporting mechanisms that if they report something online, it's not going to come directly back to them. And that's often one of the key reasons why young people choose not to report things, because they almost want to kind of stay hidden. They don't necessarily want to get involved. Potentially, they run risk that they're going to get kind of technology confiscated if their parents or guardians find out. So actually, if young children feel like they can report information online to digital platforms, in a safe and trusting environment, it may promote kind of detection of digital self-harming behavior.
Totally. You made two interesting points. You spoke a bit about intent and context, right? It's interesting in our space. We found a cooking video that was being blocked, right? And the cooking video was about cutting an onion and the onion bleeding. And then the keywords in this video, right, were cutting and bleeding. So this type of content was actually blocked, and advertisers were more able to advertise in that space. But you could think about how cutting and bleeding could, and those types of keywords could translate to your space. And you could perhaps find yourself doing some research and going down a rabbit hole of cooking videos, right? So I think, you made an interesting point there about context being so important in terms of doing research and understanding how you're better working with data. You spoke about something else as well around transparency and reporting. Something that I've seen a lot recently, and I'm interested to hear your opinion on it, is on digital resilience, and the idea that young people, social media is inevitable, right? And engaging on social media, most young people are going to do it sometime in their early life. And the idea is that rather than banning these young people and trying to keep them away from it, the alternative is actually improve transparency, improve reporting, improve things like that, really, so these young people can engage better online and become more resilient young people. If they understand the platforms that they are engaging with and spending time on, if it's easy to navigate, if they are aware of the potential harms, that will actually make them have a better experience and better outcomes. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think resilience is really important, and I think there's lots of work going on related to resilience in lots of different domains. But I think if we look at it in the context of online safety and digital footprint, I think I guess especially in the context of young people, we know that young people use and access digital technology and online social media applications even when they perhaps shouldn't be. So if we know that that is the picture, and actually thinking about as the years kind of progress, it's only going to become easier for young people to go online and to access online. Research that we've done have identified that even children as young as kind of 6 to 7 years old are going online, accessing the internet, and coming across distressing content, even though they didn't intend to come across that content. So what it shows is that actually it's so easy for a young person to go online, and they're only a few clicks away of unintentionally coming across quite distressing, emotional content that they didn't initially go out to kind of seek. So if we're talking about kind of digital resilience, I think there's a lot of work that can be done here from a intervention prevention point of view. And I guess both in relation to digital self-harm, but this also kind of covers other online dangers more broadly, including kind of cyberbullying and kind of pornography and kind of contact with strangers, for example. So I think one kind of key strategy that we always do come back to is this notion about education, formal e-safety education. That should kind of start kind of in the early years, so thinking about kind of lower kind of school, primary school education. So children of kind of 6 to 7 years of age should be receiving education within that setting on how to behave online. And actually, formal e-safety education about online safety is widely regarded as an appropriate tool to kind of develop children's awareness about how to stay safe online and what they can do if they come into contact with dangers. And actually embedding that education early will help facilitate an environment that children feel comfortable online, but also feel comfortable in a way that if they do come into contact with strangers, they've got the strategies and the resilience and the tools to combat those intervention strategies, those kind of dangers that they come into contact with. So I think education is primarily important. As you're saying in relation to the resilience aspect, I think giving children the tools and the opportunities to develop their resilience, both within and outside the school environment, I think is important, because if children can feel like they've got the resilience to almost feel more confident when they're going online and feeling more confident knowing what to do if they come into contact with certain content that is distressing or negative or hurtful or harmful, then that gives children the tools to enact in a safe way. So I think resilience is typically a very good strategy that both schools, policy, and digital media platforms could utilize to try and make children feel safer online.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Macaulay. I know that we're coming up on time. Just want to ask one more question before we close. Are there any resources or any advice that you'd like to highlight for parents, caregivers, young people, advertisers, the entire ecosystem that we could utilize to help navigate this?
Yeah. So again, I think there's lots of suggestions that we could kind of go into detail here, but just trying to give a bit of a summary on some of the key aspects and take home messages for kind of parents, practitioners, and so forth. I think the key message here is that we need to reiterate that the digital behaviors are often signals. So it's not the problem itself. So if we're thinking about digital self-harm, individuals that are engaging in that behavior, that's a signal. It's not a problem. So we need to treat those sorts of behaviors that actually there's something going wrong here. That individual that is engaging in that digital self-harm behavior needs support, needs help. So actually looking at these kind of content that we see online, especially in the context of digital self-harm, treat it as a signal that we can enact on and that we can respond to. So if we kind of look at the home environment initially, so thinking about parents and guardians that have kind of young children, what can they do? Well, I think parents and guardians can try and provide an open, trusting environment. So one kind of good key strategy that parents and guardians can use, especially for younger children going through that transition from kind of late childhood into early adolescence, is actually just talking to children about what they've done online, what they've seen online. What have they most enjoyed about being online today, or what's their favorite game that they're playing online? And actually, if children feel like they can start to have that open conversation with parents and guardians that is non-judgmental, is trusting, then ultimately children are going to feel more open to disclose certain information if they do come into come into contact with things that are negative or distressing. So I think that's kind of one strategy that parents and guardians can initially implement. I think also as well is things that teachers and schools can try and implement is, obviously we've talked about the education angle, teaching children about the appropriate behaviour online. So thinking about kind of traditional face-to-face environment, we all typically know how to behave in the school environment. We know how to behave when we go down to go to the shop. We know how to behave when we interact with somebody on the street. The exact same rules apply online, but because it's online, we've got that minimization of authority figures. We haven't got any kind of rules present, that minimization of authority, the idea that we can say and do things without any immediate consequences. So these are all the sorts of things that are facilitating some negative aspects online. But if we can educate children on the appropriate strategies on how to behave online, what is good behavior, what's not good behavior, how to seek help if you do come into contact with things, I think that is also a good strategy as well. And I guess kind of from a platform, digital platform, advertiser, brand point of view, I guess it's more collaborative work. So I think there needs to be more collaborative work, both with the digital platform and the advertisers and brands, as well as research-informed information, and actually using that in a way to kind of build an environment online that is free of kind of negative, distressing content and abuse. And again, that's kind of the work that we're doing at the University of Derby, and the work that I'm doing, kind of looking at different ways that we can kind of counteract digital self-harm. And I guess from a policy point of view, and again, thinking about kind of government legislation and government guidance, and again, this is going to be culturally and country specific, but I guess policy could feed into things about providing further support for parents, providing further education for both not only the children but also the parents themselves, and providing resources. So quite often there's a digital generational divide between children and their parents and guardians, and parents and guardians don't necessarily feel like they've got the tools to understand what their child is engaging with online, and that often explains children's behaviour online and what they do, because parents and guardians don't necessarily know how to handle or manage those sorts of behaviours. So I think further education needs to be embedded both within children as well as parents, and further engagement with kind of digital technology companies and organisations, I think would be really helpful.
Great. That was very thorough. Thank you. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all the good work that you're doing. We so appreciate it.
No problem at all, Aaron. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today. And yeah, I very much look forward to speaking with you soon as well.
Fantastic.